All right, now we're here. Twitch.tv/110sports, 110sportsmedia.com/live. Thank you so much for joining us on a Wednesday. Chris Brown is here with me. We got a lot to discuss, a lot to get to in the sports world. We'll get you ready for New Year's Eve and what's going on in the sports world on the show today. But first and foremost, Chris, how you doing, buddy? How was your Christmas? It's been a little while since I've spoken to you. How you doing?
Yeah, doing pretty good, Josh. Pretty good Christmas, all things considered. A different Christmas, given the circumstances. But I think that's the case for a lot of people. So making the best of it, and whatnot. So how about you, sir?
Yeah, pretty solid. As I was telling you before we hit the go button, that luckily my family's Christmas tradition was one that fit into the guidelines mostly of the CDC and social distancing and this age of coronavirus. So, my grandmother didn't spend the night with us this year, but we always have the tradition that we're at home on Christmas Day and Christmas Eve. So, of course, that certainly fell into the guidelines. So, thankfully, not too big of a deal, and everybody was healthy. So, my bar was pretty low for a successful Christmas this year. I just wanted everybody to be healthy, and that's what I got.
Yeah.
So I'll certainly take it.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, you gotta. Yeah, that's the thing I always try to remind myself is just keep it in perspective, and try to find the bright side because with everything going on, just finding the bright side, being optimistic. Sort of. Yeah, people are healthy, so that's your sort of number one positive that you can always have right there. So,
without a doubt. Let me set the agenda real quick for the people. We're going to start with NBA injuries. Chris, there were 38 players that were either game time decisions or out last night in the NBA. That's ridiculous. There's some important names that are out as well, so we'll get to those. We'll talk college basketball slate from last night in the second segment of the first hour. Northwestern might actually be good. Like they ended up being a 16-point deficit or loss or whatever to Iowa, but that's a good basketball team. We'll get to that and some of the other things that happened last night in the college basketball world. Humor me, please, to end out the first hour, and then like last week, we'll get Josh Doring in here. We'll do the podium of the best bowl games coming up that are not part of the college football playoff. We'll do Final Five, and what are you watching for the rest of the week. Get out of here for New Year's, and we'll see you in 20. We'll see you next year, man. It'll have been a year since I saw you. All of that corny crap that we say when the calendar changes to the new year. But let's start, like I said, Chris, with the injury report. There's an NBA injury report page on CBSSports.com, and it is telling. In terms of daily players, last night there was another 10, 12, 15 that were either out or game time decisions. All but one was a game time decision. But on Tuesday, you had so many guys out. You have rookies that are out. You have important players from a lot of different teams that are out or that were game time decisions. And I think it's fair to ask this question: how big of an impact does the shortened offseason for a lot of these teams, or at least the abbreviated training? Because that's the other part of this. I think it's fair to say that for most teams, or 14 teams, I suppose. No, 8 teams. It's been 9 months since they played basketball, so it's not like they haven't had their time to rest. But I think an unappreciated part of this is getting your body ready once you start getting your body ready. Because there's a difference between rest and then getting your body ready for the regular season. When you're getting into getting into training camp, a month and a half, 2 months before the season actually starts, when you're getting back into the swing of things for real, when you're, working out for hours a day, getting your body in shape, getting your muscles ready for the season, I think that's an unappreciated part of the process, that it's not just rest, but also then gearing your body back up for for the regular season and to take the brunt of the regular season and what your body's going to have to endure. And when you start only 21 days, training camp started on December 1st, just 21 days before the season started. That's not nearly as much time as it usually is. And right, we'll never know if that's the reason why we've had so many little injuries and some bigger injuries to important players, but it certainly is a fair question to ask and a fair thing to wonder how big of an impact this sort of shortened preparation for the season has impacted injuries early on.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm going to unsurprisingly make a comparison to baseball here out of the gate, but it happened in the summer in baseball, right? There were pitchers who throughout the course of the season said, because pitchers especially, they need lots of time in spring training to sort of get into a rhythm. Batters need time to get their timing down at the plate. So they had part of spring training. It got shut down. They come back for training camp. And that's a shorter ramp up period to the regular season than they normally would have. It was like 3 weeks. And the players also didn't get a whole bunch of notice before those 3 weeks that it was going to be ramping up that quickly, because it was like, when is it going to start? We don't know. And that affected a lot of players. There were a lot of players who said, that quick ramp up for players who are used to having this extended, like 6, 7, 8 week period where they're getting ready for the season in their own rhythm, whether, just all the athletes are creatures of habit, right?
Sure.
They're creatures of habit when
especially
it comes
baseball players.
Yes, especially baseball players, 100%. And, it takes time for that rhythm. Like they have this, a lot of players, veteran players will have some sort of system in mind for how they ramp up their activity heading into a season. And so you have an NBA setup that's similar in the sense of a quicker ramp up to the season. And like you said, some players had a lot of time off, but I'm with you in that 100%. Just because it's the time off doesn't mean that translates into them sort of being ready on the same level, because that's not all time that you're sort of ramping up to the season in the same way that you normally would. So I think a lot of these injuries, again, like you said, we're never going to know, but I have to imagine a lot of these injuries, especially some of these injuries that I feel like would be injuries that could come from not necessarily getting the amount of reps that you normally would, getting that time, like maybe a calf strain, for example, something like that. I could see, and again, not that we can point to every calf strain and say, that's, make any sort of direct correlation. But I think injuries like that, for example, things that might be because the player didn't really get the time to ramp up at the same pace and that they normally would, could absolutely be related and factored into the unique nature of the ramp up to this season that we've had in the NBA.
It's fair to point out a couple things here. On December 23rd being the second day of the season and the day that there were 13 games played, there was only one guy that was out, and he was only out because of COVID-19, and that was Kenyon Martin Jr., the Houston Rockets' new draft pick, their second-round draft pick. So there was one guy out. So it's not like there were a ton of guys that started there. And the other thing I want to point out is that apart from there being 4 players on Monday with the Houston Rockets being out for COVID-19 and some of that contact tracing stuff with James Harden, there haven't been a ton of COVID-19 issues either. So I think it's fair to point those two things out, that we didn't start like this.
Right.
Which would have also been a fair point, considering, usually you have more time to recover from an injury. If you tweak an ankle in training camp, it's usually okay because you've still got, another 5-6 weeks before the season actually started. So it's not like we started with all of these guys on the injured list. I suppose that's not, but just out or a game time decision. And then very quickly, Monday, December 28th, there was 10. And then, like I said, on Tuesday, there were 38 players in the NBA who were either out or a game time decision. And it was probably 22 of them were game time decisions, and the other 16 or so were out until expected January 1st, January 8th, whatever it might be. But it's fair to also point that out, that we didn't start there, that we've had a lot of, an ankle, a knee, a hip, a quad, and those like muscles specifically in your legs, whether it's a hamstring or a calf or a quad or a groin. Those are the kind of things that, not lack of preparation, because that has a negative connotation to the player, because the player's doing all that they can, but
Right.
the abbreviated preparation, those kind of injuries, you can point to being maybe have something to do with the shorter preparation time. Of course, John Morant tweaking his ankle
Right.
doesn't really have that same effect, because, and more than tweaking, he's going to be out 3 to 5 weeks, and really, really messing up his ankle. Thankfully, didn't break it. But right, he went up, he jumped, and then landed on somebody else's foot. So like that didn't happen because of his lack of preparation. But there are quite a bit of, my hip, my knee, my
Right.
ankles, groin, quad, calf, that kind of thing. So there are some of those tendons, muscle groups that are, you see some of those injuries that often are talked about when you're talking about, okay, how can this lack of preparation impact some of these sort of knick-knack injuries, and just injuries that happen because you step a little too far, or you burst a little too quick, or you get your foot caught on the floor a little bit, and those areas are just a little bit more vulnerable if you haven't had as much time to prepare them.
Right, exactly. And I, when I first started sort of doing some looking at stories and research for when we were going to talk about this, I sort of, I first went to the big injuries that we have right now, the John Morant, the Kevin Love, the Spencer Dinwiddie. And I was looking and I was kind of thinking, well, most of these injuries and a couple others, most of these injuries, you know, don't really seem like they could really be tied to that, right? You mentioned
Right.
with John Morant, it was just an awkward landing when he was trying to block a shot. Spencer Dinwiddie was injured on a drive to the basket in which he drew contact and
Mm.
landed awkwardly. So like those are things you can't. So first I was like, these injuries just kind of seem like just weird injuries. But then the more I looked at it and the more I started poking around at just sort of like injury updates for just players that I wasn't even that knowledgeable, that like lower profile players,
Sure.
lower profile injuries. I started to see sort of update after update that were those types of injuries, like you mentioned, those sort of like strains, pulls, things that can happen as a result of, be more likely to happen, I should say, as a result of not having that time to build up at the same level as you normally would. Because I think, yeah, that's the key for people who, people who played sports, people who've seen it, athletes in all sorts of sports. There's the same idea that it's
Well, hopefully we get Chris back here in a moment. It looks like he froze. Hopefully, if he does lag out of the call, then we'll get him back in here and figure out how to move forward. But yeah, it's a good point that some of these main injuries and the ones that are making the headlines, of course, John Morant, who had gotten off to a phenomenal start this season, both as from a pure points perspective, but also from an efficiency perspective. Spencer Dinwiddie, those kind of injuries, yes, some of them probably not. And yes, there we go. We lost Chris a little bit. We'll go to the solo one for a moment. Hey, how you doing there? Right. I think it's a fair thing to point out, right? It's some of these big injuries to these bigger players not probably don't have as much to do with it, but some of these knick-knack injuries. And the other part of this is 72 games. 72 game season. That's where we're at right now, right? It's a 72 game season. And the more games you miss, the more important it is, right? Because each game matters more this season. It's much closer to 2% per your final record, for your final record, than it usually is. And as a result, games matter more, and therefore teams missing games without their full strength, that's really, really important, because you only have 72 of them. For example, between now and January 27th, which is the the official the current expectation date for Ja Morant to come back, the Grizzlies play another 17 games, 12, 13, 14 games. They've already played 3, and now we're talking about playing roughly 20 of your games already, and almost all of them have been without your best player. And it's not to say that they can't bounce back from that, but how they perform in this stretch will probably determine if they're going to be fighting for one of those 10 spots, and specifically those 4 play-in tournament spots, or if they're just not going to make the playoffs this year. And in an 82-game season, if you're missing Ja Morant for 3 to 5 weeks, that's probably going to happen anyways. But in this kind of season, it's even more important than it usually is. Chris Brown is back with us. Chris, welcome back. But
Thank you.
As you were saying, a lot of the smaller injuries and sort of the injuries around the edges, so to speak, are some of these, pulled a groin, pulled a calf, a strain here, a strain there. So while it's not those bigger guys that are having those injuries that are, the pulls and the strains, unfortunately, some of these other injuries are more important than, or are bigger than that and more serious than that. But around the edges, there are certainly quite a few of those injuries, and those injuries have a bigger impact than they usually do because we have a shortened season with only 72 games as opposed to 82.
Right. And, I wonder if we're going to see more of these kind of injuries. The season's still very young, so I'm curious about that. I'm curious about teams' approach to trying to bring guys back. You got to be careful not to bring guys back too early from whether they be small injuries and tweaks, because those kind of, strains are likely, those are injuries that can reoccur, right? Like Kevin Love suffered a calf strain back in the preseason, and then he was sort of working his way back, and then it happened again. So those kind of things can happen. So you have to be careful with that idea, and also with those sort of the star players, right, that are out for several weeks, like you were mentioning with Ja Morant. You have to be careful, of course, in bringing him back. Of course, he means so much to that team. At the same time, right, you want him back as soon as possible, but you also don't want to bring him back too soon and have him land back on the sidelines. Obviously, with him in particular, he just means so much to that team. I mean, obviously, you're very well aware of that. I was amazed to see, that his total usage, which is, the amount of plays that he's shot the ball, gotten fouled, made the pass that led to the shot, or turned the ball over. It's nearly 60% of that team. It's second highest in the NBA. Like, he just means so much to that offense. He's so much of that spark for that team that, I mean, they don't have any, and you can probably speak, I mean, obviously you can speak to this. I think it seems like they're going to really struggle over the next month because there aren't really too many obvious candidates to pick up the slack there. There are some guys that you can plug in, but it doesn't seem like given how much value he has to that team, and there isn't just somebody who can step up and replicate that kind of production for them in particular, and that injury in particular, it was a real blow to them given how they're set up.
It's interesting because you're absolutely right, and anybody saying that Ja Morant's not the best player that Memphis has is just silly. But they did win in Brooklyn.
Sure.
They did win that game in Brooklyn that he went down. So Ja plays 13 minutes in that game. And so I think you're right in terms of the team that has the most serious injury, when you consider the severity of the injury and also how important that player is to the team from a usage rate perspective. The Grizzlies you probably are first on that list. But I think at the same time, putting guys in there and expecting more from them might be a good thing. I'm a little worried about, and I think Ja's it just has some things that Russell Westbrook doesn't, in terms of there are just some intangibles about him that I like more. But in terms of the Thunder with Russell Westbrook and without Kevin Durant fell into this incredible usage rate thing where Russell Westbrook was putting up insane numbers, and they were an okay team, but they certainly weren't a great one. And
Right.
John Morant had looked really, really good, and his usage rates were really, really high, but they had lost 2 games, quite frankly, to teams that they should probably be beating if they really want to make the playoffs, in the Spurs and the Hawks. The Hawks are off to a good start. The Spurs are off to a relatively good start as well. But specifically the Spurs, who I think will be in that area with them, fighting for one of those back end of the playoffs and play-in tournament seeds, that those are games you probably need to win. So as we move forward, they play the Celtics tonight. It's certainly something I'm going to be looking for, because you're also right that you're depending on a lot of guys to be super consistent, and some of those guys aren't incredibly consistent. Like against the Nets, Dylan Brooks had 24 points on 9 of 19 shooting. That's a really solid night for him. 7 rebounds, 4 assists, 3 steals. But at the same time, Dylan Brooks is notorious around here for being inconsistent sometimes, for fouling too much. In 3 games, he's committed 17 fouls. He's fouled out twice and committed 5 in their 3rd game. Kyle Anderson scored 28 points in that Nets game. Expecting Kyle Anderson to do that is not fair to him, and it's not like anybody else had great games. They just did enough to win that basketball game, which was great. But now you're asking them to do that consistently, and we'll see if that is something they're up to, because you're right, there's certainly a lot of pieces to the puzzle to figure out here. If you're Taylor Jenkins and that Memphis coaching staff, because of how much Ja means in terms of scoring and facilitating and just being a part of the offense all the time, like you mentioned with his usage rate.
Yeah, absolutely. Can I throw one more injury-related question your way, to your expertise?
Hit me.
So the Spencer Dinwiddie injury for the Nets, obviously, it's a big blow to them, in the sense of a huge part of their thing is their depth that they have. And I'm curious, do you think it changes their odds at all about potentially acquiring James Harden? Like, does that factor into that at all? Does it make it more likely, less likely? Is it something that you think really is influenced there? And sort of, do you think what kind of impact this has on the Nets? Obviously, it's not catastrophic, but do you think that's going to throw things off in terms of their depth and their system?
I think a couple things. One, I think if there's a team that's built to withstand that kind of injury right now, it's the Nets. There's a very obvious change for me there. You could throw a guy who's less ball dominant in there at that in the place of Dinwiddie in the starting lineup if you'd like to, or you could throw Jeff Green in there if you wanted to keep Karis LeVert for the second unit, or you throw Karis LeVert in there. I think the options there are pretty obvious and pretty easy, in my opinion, to figure out there. As for yes, of course it impacts their depth, obviously, because they lose one player. But this is one of the things I like about the Nets so much, is how deep they are and how many just respectable NBA players they have on that bench. So and when you have Kevin Durant and Kyrie Irving, you just need to have somebody be in there and be impactful in some way, whether it's being efficient or playing good defense. You don't need that guy to do a ton, so that's a good thing. I would think that makes a trade for James Harden less likely, because I was just operating under the assumption that any trade for James Harden with the Rockets, with the Nets, would include Spencer Dinwiddie, and Spencer Dinwiddie's value just decreases when you have an ACL tear. Not to say that he's not going to be the same player when he comes back, because there are a lot of guys who come back from an ACL tear and are a relatively similar player. But you just don't know right now. And if you're going to trade James Harden away, and one of the substantial pieces of the trade is somebody who's on the sideline with a ACL tear right now, then you just need to go ahead and fire the Rockets GM right now, because that would be dumb. You are, the team that gives away the superstar already always loses trades like that. And to accept a trade that has one of those big pieces being a guy who you're not going to be able to see until next season anyways, and you're not entirely sure what he'll look like when he comes back, would be dumb. But
Right.
I don't think we're going to get to the point that I think there's a chance that we get to the trade deadline and the Nets think that they're good and that they don't
Hmm.
need him and they like the things that are going on around KD and Kyrie. And I also think that I think the Rockets are being very selective. Like they have no incentive to move him for something less than he's worth. And
Right.
I think if Brooklyn had enough to throw at the Rockets, and the Rockets deemed that what James Harden's worth, that it would have happened already. And Dinwiddie going down certainly doesn't help that situation.
Gotcha. Yeah, no, that makes complete sense. I think, especially given the circumstances there and with the depth that that team has, like you're right in the sense that like because we talked about it, or I think we talked about it before. I listened to you and Josh talk about it. Just the idea that this is a team that has the ability to kind of withstand that
Yep.
because of the amount of depth. Obviously, it's a hit, but given the system that they have in place, it shouldn't be that catastrophic.
Yeah. Coming up next, we'll talk about some college basketball from last night. Humor me, please, to round out the first hour. That's all coming up next. You're watching 110 Daily on the 110 Sports Network.